So back when I was 25 years old, I had my first midlife crisis. I think a lot of people have a midlife crisis at 25 years old, and I was no exception. And it's interesting to reflect on how I really do recognize who I was from 25 till 26 and onwards, but I don't really recognize myself as a 24-year-old. And so what I thought I would do in today's video is show you some pictures and videos from my first solo Europe trip that I embarked on. I'd already been to Europe with a bunch of Aussie guys when I was 22, but when I was 25, it was very important for me to go on this big fat Europe trip. You know, I'd been working in a share company, doing data entry day in and day out, getting ESTJ bosses who were throwing pencils at me and screaming at me. You know, it was very important for me to drift out of that job and just to get all of my savings and to head off to Europe. And so my first destination was Frankfurt. So I flew from Australia to Frankfurt. I didn't sleep. Here's, I think, the first day that I'm in Heidelberg. So it's probably about maybe 30 hours of no sleep at this point.
Well, here I am, lost in some sort of forest thingy. I was trying to get to Dilsberg, but instead I'm just walking around with this water.
And yeah, my next destination was to go to Utrecht, mainly because it's known as a very nice student town in the Netherlands, and apparently 325 years ago my ancestors are from there before they went to Sri Lanka. And Utrecht was a really nice town. I went on a very epic bike ride on one of the days, and I got very sunburnt and very exhausted. So by the time I got to Paris and I stayed in a hostel, I was being my usual self, sort of smiling at people, but not being particularly friendly. But I do remember I wanted to do things that were off the beaten track. I was always going online and looking for places that were seen as a bit more different. So one thing that I did in Paris was I went into the old 19th century sewers. They've got a museum there. And I wasn't that interested once I was in the sewers. It was a bit smelly, and I thought, this isn't good. I remember walking all the way back to Montmartre. I know I can't pronounce any French words. And I remember thinking, I have to change this trajectory I'm on. I'm feeling miserable and I'm in Paris. This is not good. And so what happened is I went and had a nice shower. I probably skipped dinner as usual, but I did start speaking to people in my hostel room, and it made a world of difference, I recall. I talked to a guy from San Antonio in Texas who was learning Chinese, and he was really friendly, and it was good to talk to him. And there was a woman from Portland, Oregon in her 40s, and she was cycling in Paris, and I talked to her. And there was a girl from Sydney who had sex with an Argentinian guy who was in our room, and I even talked to her. But I remember I did this really creepy thing. Well, it wasn't that creepy, but I was in my bunk bed, and she'd basically texted the Argentinian guy and given her phone to him to read the message. And then I heard a condom being unwrapped, and I heard her and the Argentinian guy leave the hostel room, and I felt very uncomfortable. I mean, I was a prude then, and I'm a prude now, and I remember finding the whole thing uncomfortable. I remember later she was in the room at night, or she came in at 2 a.m, and I can't remember what I said. Maybe it was just hi or something in the dark hostel room as she came into the room. And I remember this girl from Sydney saying, "Who are you? Who's talking to me?" And I said, "I'm your Australian conscience," which is such a weird thing to say. Luckily, we had a normal conversation about whether Sydney or Melbourne is better. I remember her saying that Melbourne is shit, Sydney's better. Anyway, my next destination was Lyon. And I remember in the morning I went up to see some sort of church or something. Here's video footage of me looking miserable in Lyon.
Here I am, somewhere in Lyon, near the Basilica of Notre Dame. And I'm really, really hot and sweaty, and I didn't get a drink, and I might be dead by the time I get back to Lyon. Oh well, bye-bye.
Now after that, I hopped on a train and I went to Switzerland and then Milan. And Milan was quite awful. I couldn't withdraw cash. I kept seeing people getting beaten up, and I kept seeing car accidents. It was just a very rough area around Milan station. But in my hostel room, there was a rough looking guy from Manchester and an Asian girl in my room. Now this Asian girl was an ENTP from Singapore. So we started just getting on really well and just chatting. We chatted for hours, and then the guy from Manchester, the British guy with tattoos, he was really nice too. So the three of us just chatted for like an hour or two, and it completely lifted my mood. And the ENTP girl from Singapore, she actually woke me because she was leaving at I think 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. So she was leaving Milan, and she actually left money for me. I feel like this is very ENTP because they can be extremely generous. But this girl left me money by my bed and said, "Us travelers have to look out for each other." And that money actually enabled me to get a minibus to the airport and to buy myself a cappuccino and a croissant. Anyway, after that I went from Milan and I flew to Prague. And originally I was going to stay in Prague, but I'd actually cancelled my hostel because I felt embarrassed that I was going to such a tourist destination. I felt like I needed to do something a bit unique. And even though it's very pretentious and shows how insecure I was, I think maybe it was a good move because I decided to go to the capital of Moravia rather than the capital of Bohemia. There's a town in the Czech Republic called Olomouc, which had certain elements that were beautiful like Prague, like the old town clock and everything. So I stayed in a hostel in Olomouc, and the hostel was run by an Australian couple. They had both met each other, I think, in Newcastle, and they were history students that were married now. And the wife was super friendly and nice, but the husband was super grumpy. I remember he was nice enough to me, but we had 3 nights in this hostel, and he used to run a tour of the town every day, and he was so angry. It was like he would tell the history of the town, and he would ask us all, have you got any questions? And when we didn't say anything, he would be like, it's pointless me doing these tours if no one's going to ask me any questions. And he was very angry, but it was a very fun hostel. At that point in my life, I'd never stayed in such a cool hostel. And what had happened was I walked into my room. There was a girl with big eyes looking at me, and some other girl, and some old guy. Anyway, we all went out to dinner because there was a very social Texan girl with ginger curly hair who was so excited to have travelers in her room that she organized for us all to go out for dinner, and I was very quickly swept up in this with a 60-year-old Australian guy who was a former teacher, who was a very lovely guy. But anyway, we all went out for dinner and got on very well, and I drank a big Czech beer, and we had all this Czech food, which I guess was fried cheese on pork and things like that, and it was a wonderful night. And I hadn't had any experience like this on that trip at that point. Like, it was so relieving, and I just couldn't work out how I just stumbled on this social group. And we had social activities every day for the next 3 days. Like, the British girl had a little yellow car called Bertie, and she would drive us to these destinations. We went swimming in a lake. The girl was an ENTJ though. So what had happened was we got back to our hostel room, and she was calling me. She said that I looked gay because of my hair, and she was criticizing me, and I was feeling awkward. Now these days, I don't really tolerate this sort of talk, but I was young, and she gave me a diary telling me to put a message in it, and I said to her, let's go for a walk. It was 8 or 9 in the evening, and I said, let's go for a walk in the gardens. So we decided to go walking to the gardens, but the Texan girl didn't like us going off together, I recall, and she said she's going to come with us. And as we went down the stairs down into the main town, I remember the Texan girl, she kept saying to me, oh my god, look at my breasts, which I thought was not very becoming. But anyway, she joined us, and I was a bit annoyed because I was trying to go off with this girl. And by the time we got to the gardens, it was a bit spooky. There were big iron gates, and it was dark, and the Texan girl got spooked and ran away. She said, this is scaring me, she said. And she said, I'll meet you back at the hostel. And she just fled back. So I got to be alone with this girl, and I just remember lying down. I just remember lying down in the grass and mosquitoes biting us, and then us deciding to abort. And we went back to the town square, and there was no one there. There was a drunk guy. Then we went back to the hostel, and the Texan girl was in the room in her underwear, and she said, where have you been? I don't know, I just remember sitting with her and her crying about something. What I didn't appreciate about the Texan girl was when she left to go somewhere else in the morning, I can't remember where she was going, but she climbed up onto my bunk bed and said it was great meeting me, and she kissed me on the mouth. Like, I don't know, I was half asleep. And that next day I was also off to go to Krakow. That was my next destination. I'd always wanted to go to Poland, but I walked around, I got lunch with the British girl, and I felt pretty good walking around with her, even though she insulted me a lot. And I remember appreciating her presence. I remember in a car, we were driving and she put on David Bowie, and we were both singing along to David Bowie in the car, but she was driving, like in Australia, just like in Britain, you drive on the left side of the road, but she's driving a British car in the Czech Republic, so she was often confused. I think we nearly hit pedestrians and she swerved, and then I don't know if we hit something. We didn't hit anything. It was just like a near accident, and she was quite annoyed because she was freaking out, but I just kept singing David Bowie. It was the song 5 Years from Ziggy Stardust. But I didn't pay attention to the fact that we nearly had a collision, and she was very angry at me. And I wish, at the time I knew about Myers-Briggs, because I could have said, look, you're an ENTJ, you've got SE child, I'm an INFP, I've got SE blind spot, which very much explains why I didn't react to the near collision. But anyway, she drove me to the station where I was going to get my train to Krakow, but she asked me if I wanted to abandon my plans and hop in the car with her, and we will go camping around France. And I thought, well, I've got another 2 weeks of my trip. Should I really be going off with this girl, staying in a car, drifting around Europe? Probably would have been quite fun, but I said no, which was a mature decision on my part, I'll have you know. And then I went off to Krakow, and I stayed in a hostel called the Elephant on the Moon, and they put me in a room for lonely people. They had special rooms in this hostel for depending on how they categorized you, and they put me in a tramp room, so that it had like a little boot on the key to show that you were like a vagabond, which I very much was. I spent 3 days wandering around in Krakow by myself. It was a lovely city. I loved being in Poland. I remember feeling like I vibed a little bit more with the people there. What else happened? There was an INFP who was in that hostel. She was from Alaska. Sometimes we would smile at each other and I would blush and go off by myself. And one morning there was no one in it was a big house really. And I remember we were both looking at the things to do in Krakow at the front door. And it was like such an opportunity for me to say hi to her. Anyway, she went to Auschwitz and I went to a Japanese samurai sword museum, if you must know. And I finished the day off with a kebab, and I remember feeling a little bit down as well. And I had really bad allergies. So that's the story of Poland. The next morning, luckily though, the woman running the hostel told me that there were no trams to get me to the main station. So she organized for a taxi to come, and she popped me and the INFP girl in the taxi. And we went to the station and I asked her if she wanted to get a coffee, and she said yes. And we talked a lot. She's the reason I went to Belarus many years later, because she I found out was married, but I didn't know she was married at the time. But she had actually been drifting around Europe by herself, and she had gone to Belarus for 2 weeks by herself, and she was just telling me what a great experience it was. And I always thought to myself, I need to go to Belarus. So she was also cool because she could speak Russian. It's like she had some sort of Russian ancestry, but she was from Alaska. So that was that. I just felt really good for having a coffee with her. And then I flew to Sweden. I arrived in Sweden at 4 p.m. so I couldn't get from the airport. It was an outer airport because I was catching Ryanair, but I couldn't get to my hostel in time. And once again, I've got no smartphone or anything, so I had to track down an internet cafe and book another hostel. Was there anything open in Stockholm? Well, there was one hostel that was closing at 8 p.m, I remember. Something like that had happened, so I just remember running to a hostel run by a Turkish guy. And I stayed in this hostel, and there was a very beautiful blonde girl. She was a model, actually. And eventually this girl started talking to me. She had her boyfriend with her. They were both Dutch, and she was from Maastricht. Anyway, the boyfriend went to bed, and so I was just talking for hours with this girl, and I was a bit thrown off because once again I was 25, and so I was a bit embarrassed to talk to her, but she was so easy to talk to, and we clicked so well that we talked for hours and hours and hours. Looking back, I don't know if she was an INFP or an ENFP, but I can only see her as one of those two types. And so that was a nice moment in my Stockholm trip, but mainly I was getting in a pretty bad mood in Stockholm. I wasn't eating right. I was avoiding eating because it was so expensive there. But luckily the Dutch girl now and again would chat to me. And I remember her once, I'd been out for the whole day. I was going to random suburbs in Stockholm and coming back. I got back to my hostel at about 6 p.m. and this girl said to me she was looking for me all day. She wanted to tell me something. And I was like, oh, what's that? And she says to me she walked into the bathroom and she saw a guy taking a dump. And I was like, huh? What? Because I was thinking, why is she telling me this? She's like, oh, sorry, my English isn't good. I shit. And I was like, yeah, I know what you mean. And she was like, yeah, I just wanted to tell you that. And I thought to myself, what an interesting girl. There was also a weird thing with another Dutch guy who came into our hostel without a booking, and he was really awkward. He got angry at me because my Facebook account at the time, when it asked about my relationship status, I'd put widowed, and he was very angry at me saying death is no laughing matter. And he also got angry because in our hostel room I remember he was like looking at everyone's bags and he's like, "Are there any girls in this room?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he was investigating their bags and realizing that it was men in his hostel room, and he started going, "Shit, shit," which I thought was very strange. And in the morning, I remember he also confronted me. He said that I was talking in my sleep. Now, I don't know why I was talking in my sleep. Maybe I was concerned about money because I guess I was unemployed and I was in Sweden. But he kept asking me why. Why were you saying that? And I said, I don't know. So I guess that was a not so good aspect of my time in Sweden. And then in Uppsala, I was in a hostel with two Dutch twins who were cycling around. They were very nice. They had like a scrapbook they were making. And that was basically it, I think. I went to some museums. I went to the big Viking sort of monuments and whatever they have there in Uppsala. I read Camus and Sartre. I think I read Nausea. I think I read the bulk of Nausea by a river there in Uppsala. There's not really much else to say about that. And I went to Estonia and I stayed in a hostel, and I was really hoping in Estonia, like I felt like going to Estonia was quite brave. Like I remember it was quite exciting at the time. I felt like Estonia was so far from Australia. But once I got to Estonia and I got to my hostel, I was shocked that the person running it was from Australia. And when I went up into the hostel room, it was just like loads of Australians and some Americans, and they were actually watching Australian football. So I was so disappointed because the whole reason I'd gone to Estonia was to show that I am not like other Aussies. I was so upset, and all the guys would go out to like the strip clubs and everything in Tallinn. So I would avoid them. Like I'd walk around Tallinn at night, and then I'd purposely come back to my hostel room at midnight, knowing that all of the Aussies and American guys, and it was all guys, no girls. Just to avoid them, I'd go and I'd sneak back into the hostel and go to my bunk bed. And I did that 2 nights in a row until the Australian guy, who was from Canberra, he asked me if I'm okay, and he had a nice chat, and he was a really nice guy, and he really cheered me up. And the guy from Australia had told me that when he was in Riga, he'd bumped into a guy and pistols came out of his coat. I don't know if this guy was lying. I don't think he was lying. But he warned me that even though Riga's a beautiful city, he's like, it's got a pretty high crime rate. So it was good advice, I suppose. And I took the bus and I got myself to Riga. And typically I got to the hostel. And when I pressed the buzzer, the guy who let me in was Australian. And once again, it was an Australian-run hostel in the Baltic state. So I was a little bit annoyed. And as I put down my bag and I get taken to my room and then back to the common room in this hostel in Riga, yeah, there was an Aussie guy having a good-natured argument with a guy from Perth in Scotland, and they were drinking shots and laughing. So I heard the Scottish guy saying to the Australian guy that the problem with you Australians is you're all fucking thick, or he was mocking him. And from the reception, I yelled out at the Scottish guy and I said, "Who the fuck you think you're talking to, mate? I'm from Australia. I've wrestled crocodiles, mate." I said something like that. And all the guys who were drunk, they all went, "Oi," and they all hugged me. And it was probably a good move. I remember being in a really good mood, being given all of these shots. And the very charismatic Scottish guy told us a story about how he got robbed and beaten up on his first night in Riga. But he told it in a way that was very funny. And we all went out on a pub crawl that night. And all of a sudden, I'm with all these guys. There was an old guy from Amsterdam, there was a Canadian guy, there was the Aussie guy, there was the Scottish guy, and there was a point when I just got so drunk that I thought to myself, I need to get away from this group of guys. This isn't why I went on this trip. Like, it's nice that I'm finally getting drunk. But I don't know, I remember talking to 2 Austrian guys, and they were telling me how they had been cycling around Europe. They'd been cycling from Vienna, and now they were in Riga. But the Austrian guys said to me that they've been cycling from town to town, and neither of these guys had had even a single kiss with a girl. And I was like, oh, my condolences. So they were really nice to talk to. And then I went to find my group. I remember there was like one Canadian guy who told me that they've all left, and he was going to show me to where they were, but I declined. And so I lost everyone. And then I lost the Austrian guys. And then I was like in Riga, really drunk at midnight and lost. I had no idea where I was. And I thought, this is dangerous because I've heard all these stories about people getting robbed. I think that's what the guy in Estonia told me. He said, if you're going to go to Latvia, just don't go out at night drunk. And now I was like out at night drunk. But I remember just walking with a lot of confidence. So I just told myself probably the wrong thing to do. But I walked around lost for an hour in Riga in the old town. So it was kind of touristy. I don't think it was actually dangerous. And I did find myself back in bed. Some Latvian staff member got me back to my bed. And then the next day, I was just super hungover. I went to the Occupation Museum. I learned a lot about history. I went to the Latvian Orthodox Church just because of the Seinfeld reference. I got attacked in an underpass by a Russian dude who punched me in the back. I got stuck in the rain. I ate rye bread from a supermarket thinking it was cake. I went back to my hostel room. There'd been a guy from New Delhi in my room, and he kept wanting to go out that night. It was a Saturday night, and I said, oh, I'm so hungover, I'm so tired. But he just kept insisting, and then I finally said, okay, fine. And there was a very tall Dutch guy who was just checking in the hostel, and he was very friendly. He had very ENFP vibes, and he asked if he could come along, and I said, I'd love you to come along. And so he and the Indian guy and myself went to this traditional club, and it was so funny because the New Delhi man, he was very dressed up for the occasion, and he was really on a mission. And as soon as he got in there, he was just chatting up every woman, and he would like really do himself up, and he would not propose, I don't know, he would go up to every Latvian woman and say something, and you'd see them just shake their head at him, and you just go to the next girl and the next girl. And I just remember the Dutch guy smiling and saying to me, looks like our friend is on a little bit of a mission. And that night ended with there was like a house band, and they were playing songs, and they were playing the song You Are So Beautiful to Me, Can't You See, etc. And there was a very tall girl, and I guess because she had seen this Dutch guy who was very tall, she had actually just grabbed him by the hand and led him onto the dance floor, and she'd put her arms around him. And I just remember them like doing this dance, and the Dutch guy just looking at me like, you know, what's going on here? That was kind of cool. She had a friend who danced with me, and we danced a bit, and the girl looked very unenthusiastic dancing with me. And at some point I thought I should say something. So I said, you know, how's your night going? She's like, good. And I asked, where is she from? She's like, I'm from Riga, of course, because we were in Riga. And then she said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Australia. And she goes, excuse me. And she walks away. I like to think that she had some sort of bad experience with Aussies. Or maybe Aussies have got such a bad reputation in Latvia. I don't know. I thought that was just really funny. I actually said goodbye to the New Delhi man and the Dutch guy because it was 2 in the morning, and I remember I hadn't had dinner, but I went back to my hostel, and then there were more Dutch girls, and they were all like in makeup, and I was really intimidated, and I went into my top bunk, because I always chose the top bunk in any hostel room, and the 3 girls were like, oh, so what are you doing? You're just traveling around, you know, finding yourself. They were saying stuff like that, and I found it very intimidating because I just remember just sort of facing the wall in my bunk bed and trying to ignore the fact that there were these girls all sort of getting changed in my room. Again, I was 25 years old, okay? And of course, once I got to Lithuania and I got to my hostel, naturally it was run by Australians. At least some of the staff were Australians. I don't remember the actual people in the hostel being Australian. It was mainly a bunch of middle-class British guys from London, and I didn't really like them. And usually I love British people. When I'm traveling, I get on very well with them usually. And they were going out at night and partying, and what had happened is in my room there was a Japanese guy. There was also a girl from New Rochelle, is it? Like a girl from New York. She was really cool, but yeah, the British girls and guys were all in the room. People were having sex in the dorm, and it upset the Japanese guy. Oh yeah, because people were having sex in his bed, and he asked them to please get out of his bed, and apparently the British girl said ni hao to him, so he was upset. And then apparently, when there was more hanky-panky going on in the room, apparently the Japanese guy punched the wall in rage, and it scared people. But this was all the night before I came to Lithuania. I can't really tell you too many stories about my time in Vilnius. I quite liked it. I was still starving myself and feeling a little bit down and lonely. There were certainly occasions where I could have hung out with that girl from New York, but I think I chose to be alone, and I went to a genocide museum, which was actually just a KGB museum. When I went back to Lithuania many years later, I went to the Holocaust Museum, which is a bit more hidden. But yeah, that's all I did in Vilnius. I remember seeing a lot of priests walking around, and they seemed like gangsters, and they had like their compadres near them. And the only real notable thing I remember in Lithuania was just watching that Japanese guy romance a Lithuanian girl. I remember he'd brought her up to our room, and he was pouring her tea and chatting to her, and he was being very romantic. And I just remember the next day walking around by myself in Vilnius and seeing him in a park, and he had his head on her lap. That's what I remember. And I thought, that's nice. He's romancing her, and in a very nice way. And I remember, once again, I was trying to escape my Aussiness on this trip, and I think I was very I don't know, I just thought it was nice to see. But by this point, it was really the end of my Europe trip. I was due to fly back from Germany to Australia, so I had my 2 days in Vilnius. I remember I went to the train station to get a train to the airport, and there was a pigeon flew into the train station, and it was trying to get out through the window, but it couldn't. And there was a man who smiled, and he grabbed the pigeon, and instead of taking the pigeon and releasing it and letting it free, he actually walked the pigeon into a bathroom. I don't know what happened. I don't want to know what happened, but that was the end of my Europe trip, and I think that's quite symbolic. And that's the end of this very long story. And I don't know if anyone's still watching, but that's my Europe trip. And I did come back to Australia feeling pretty different. I did start distancing myself from a lot of friends, which was very difficult at the time. It was very difficult to sort of lean into who I felt I was, but I'm glad I did. It sort of led to me going back to film school. I think the biggest thing that Europe trip taught me was that I can be myself and get along very well with people, and I don't have to worry about this idea that I'm antisocial or too weird, because I felt like I now had evidence that I am capable of a trip like that. I'm capable of enriching myself and meeting lots of different people and seeing lots of different countries. The other great thing was I was writing every day. I really got into a habit of taking my writing a bit more seriously. And every day I would write a journal about what I had seen and done. I suppose at the same time I was also reading more existential books, and all of it I think came together and made me feel less ashamed of being pretentious as well. Like, I felt like I was just doing everything you shouldn't do as an Australian. That's how it felt, like taking things a bit more, looking at life in a bit more of a romantic and sensitive way, being really excited about these experiences. I don't know why at the time I thought that was un-Australian, but maybe it was un-Australian. I think it was a very necessary trip. I don't know what I would have been like if I hadn't done something like that. That was the first great Europe trip that kind of set the tone for my wonderful 30s. My 30s was terrible in many ways, but my Europe trips in my 30s were mwah, 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 mwah. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. If you lasted this long, I don't know why you would have watched the whole thing, but yeah, see you next time.